Welcome to Module 4, Modernizing Ohio. Throughout this module, we will explore what modernizing means. In this lecture, modernizing means an attempt to address long-standing issues of inequity in the economy, of unsafe work environments, of exploitation that enriched a handful of Ohioans and degraded large numbers of others. Modernizing means, in other words, a struggle to answer a question that had persisted since Cincinnati's heyday in the pigs and cotton pan-Mississippian world. What are the social costs of inexpensive, mass-produced products? And in this photo, you see some of those costs. It was taken during the 1930s in Cincinnati. It shows unemployed men waiting in a line, hoping to get sent to a job that day. The sign above them warns that only clean and tidy men would get jobs. Dirty men would not be sent out. The photographer has focused his lens on their shadows, suggesting that the industrial system has reduced people to a shadow of their humanity. Let's explore Ohio in the 1930s. As one of the leading industrial economies in the United States, Ohio was hard hit by the global depression of the 1930s. Let's consider a few statistics. In 1930, unemployment reached 13.3% of Ohio's population. By 1932, that figure had skyrocketed to 37.3%. And naturally, unemployment lines were longer in Ohio's industrial centers. In Toledo, for example, unemployment at its height hit 80% of the city's population. In Cleveland, 50%. And Akron, 60%. And even if you're lucky enough to have a job, your paycheck in Ohio, on average, declined from 33% from 1929 to 1932. Ohio farmers struggled as well. The price per bushel of wheat, for example, dropped from a high of 94 cents in 1914 to 40 cents by 1933. And the Depression made worse an already difficult agricultural market. From 1925 to 1935, 20% of all Ohio farms changed ownership because of economic difficulties. African Americans felt the effects of the Depression first and longest because they were often relegated to marginal jobs and were the last hired and first fired. In a 1930 survey, 90% of Cincinnati employers said either that they did not want to hire African Americans or they refused to answer the question at all. No wonder then that by 1933, unemployment within Cincinnati's African American population was 54%. And even though African Americans comprised only 10% of the city's population, they made up 25% of the city's unemployment rate. So overall, the statistical picture is grim. Ohio suffered greatly in the Great Depression. By 1938, there were more Ohioans receiving federal assistance than residents of any other state except Pennsylvania. And Ohio led the nation in two categories no state ever wants to lead in: job loss and decline in industrial output. And in a sure sign of economic decay, 25% of Ohio's foreign-born population, its immigrants, left by 1940, seeking economic opportunity elsewhere. What caused this economic misery? Scholars still debate the question, and a full discussion of the possible answers is beyond the scope of this class on Ohio history. But it's important to note how political leaders in the 1930s answered the question. Over the course of that decade, Democrats, led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, concluded that an unequal distribution of income was the root of the problem. In the 1920s, the share of income increased for the wealthiest Americans, but decreased for most everybody else. For example, in 1920, the richest 1% controlled 12% of the national income. In 1929, however, they controlled 19%. Also, by 1929, the richest 10% of Americans controlled 40% of the nation's disposable income. In other words, wealth was increasingly centralized in the hands of fewer and fewer wealthy families. As a consequence, mass purchasing power was tapped out by 1929. With wages stretched thin and credit lines maxed out, fewer and fewer refrigerators and automobiles could be bought. This fundamental weakness exposed all sorts of other imbalances in the economy, and it triggered the Depression. So how did people respond to the Great Depression? Within Ohio, the business and political elite tended to rely on traditional ideas. Poverty and unemployment, for example, suggested an individual character flaw. You were poor or unemployed because of something you did or failed to do. You didn't work hard enough, you spent your money unwisely, or you simply hadn't improved your skills to remain in demand as a worker. As a result, whatever relief we, the community, offer to you in your time of need should be local because we know your flaws best and can watch how you spend or misspend our charity. And it should be private because public tax dollars shouldn't be involved in charity. And it should be insufficient because we don't want to subsidize your character flaws. In general, whatever reason you lost your job, you should just wait out the downturn. Struggle is good for you. Hardship provides moral depth to success. However we might evaluate these ideas today, note that they draw deeply from Ohio's past. You can hear in these words the lessons taught by William Holmes McGuffey in his 1830s school book, or in the way that Ohioans compared themselves to indolent plantation owners and celebrated the civilization they had built north of the Ohio River on the eve of the Civil War. And you can hear it in the Ohio Way, the set of cultural practices that had driven Ohio to great heights in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But not everybody defined the Depression in such terms. President Franklin Roosevelt and his supporters sought to redress persistent and destructive inequalities of wealth. They chose not to blame individuals for the misery caused by an economic system that had exploited them and then tossed them aside when convenient. And they chose to do that not by using federal power to redistribute wealth. In other words, they didn't simply jack the tax rate up on millionaires and pass the money around to the poor. Nor did they take control of private businesses and banks. They left those in the hands of the capitalists. FDR and the New Dealers instead used the federal government to empower people. In particular, they sought to protect and encourage an individual's ability to create a better life, to make their families more economically secure. They did this in a variety of ways, but most importantly, they supported unions. In 1935, Congress passed and FDR signed into law the Wagner Act, which legitimized the basic right of workers to unionize and to choose on their own their union and their leaders, and to collectively bargain with employers. FDR's goal was not to create a Soviet-style workers' collective. It was rather to even the playing field between workers and owners, to give workers a chance to negotiate higher wages and better benefits and safer working environments. The workers themselves could negotiate a healthier, wealthier life. That alone could not equalize the disparities between the richest and the poorest, but it would create better consumers, people who could sustain a dynamic mass production economy. So here's the source of conflict in Ohio during the 1930s. Business and political elites, and certainly many voters as well, opposed the Wagner Act because unions, in their opinion, threatened the process by which people became good citizens. Individuals should work hard, persevere despite obstacles, and delay purchases of luxuries, scrimping and saving, barely surviving until the economy turned for the better. Government welfare, government jobs, government protection of workers spoiled the character of Ohioans. So the key problem of the Depression was really more about relying on individual moral standards and not reforming an economic system. Of course, Ohio's workers disagreed. They said that improvement came only when people gathered together to fight established authorities. And they said, too, that pursuing self-interest would improve Ohio. Make us better consumers, they said, and we'll put people back to work, and we'll make you more profits, and we'll build healthier, happier communities. In other words, we should reform structural economic problems rather than obsess about individual morality. Ohio workers were leaders in the national union movement. For example, the sit-down strike era began in Akron in 1934 when 1,100 workers struck the General Tire Company. A sit-down strike is a form of civil disobedience in which workers at their workstation stop the assembly line and sit down, occupying the factory. This tactic hindered police efforts to violently break a strike, because the expensive machinery might get damaged, and it also undermined the owner's ability to bring in workers to break the strike. The Akron workers successfully won better wages and working conditions. As important, their success provided a model for a wave of sit-down strikes from 1936 to 1937. And Ohioans joined that wave. Approximately 250,000 Ohioans, ranging across several mass production industries like the auto, steel, and rubber industries, went on strike using the Wagner Act as legal justification. Here's how one anonymous sit-down striker described his feelings. "We were nervous," he said. "We didn't know we could do it. Those machines had kept going as long as we could remember. When we finally pulled the switch and there was some quiet, I finally remembered something, that I was a human being. that I could stop those machines, that I was better than those machines any time. It's important to note what the worker valued. It wasn't just money. It wasn't just a healthcare plan. It was his humanity, something that the industrial system had taken away from workers and something that they were trying to regain. In the 1930s, then, two worldviews clashed. One, the traditional worldview, preached the dignity of work. Work nurtured good habits such as punctuality, discipline, and thrift. These habits helped you succeed in good times and persevere when times turned tough. The new Ohio, however, preached the dignity of resistance. Industrial work involved mindless repetition of the same task. Workers were under constant pressure from the boss to speed up. Workplace injuries were a problem to bosses only to the extent that the assembly line slowed down. So resist bosses who valued machines and profits over families and communities. Fight for your self-interest, not your good habits. This wave of strikes from 1936 to 1937 successfully created the modern labor movement, compelling one industry after another to recognize the rights of workers to collectively bargain with employers. But some employers resisted, especially in Ohio. Take, for example, the Little Steel strike of 1937. Now, in 1937, U.S. Steel, then the largest steel company in the U.S., had negotiated with workers and conceded their right to collectively bargain. And so workers tried to organize the little steel companies, those smaller companies that believed it was cheaper to fight unions in the short term rather than deal with them in the longer term. These were steel companies based in or had plants around places like Canton, Warren, Youngstown, Cleveland, Massillon, and Niles. And examples of these companies, these little steel companies, were Youngstown Sheet and Tube and Republic Steel. The owners of the little steel companies like Republic Steel or Youngstown Sheet and Tube, both based in Youngstown, fought back against the workers. They relied heavily on support from the Democratic governor, Martin Davey, who sent in the Ohio National Guard to protect company property and maintain peace. For a month, neither happened. Youngstown and Warren, for example, were war zones. Riots, often started by law enforcers, led to the deaths of 6 people and countless damages to private property. Here are several photos depicting the violence. The Little Steel Strike of 1937 failed, and in 1941, with World War II looming, the workers actually managed to compel Youngstown's capitalists to follow federal law. So let's be clear about what happened during the 1930s. Business elites and political leaders rejected the use of national power in Ohio. It not only threatened their income, it threatened their definition of what a good citizen was. And so, for the first time since the 1850s, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, important segments of Ohio were out of step with the federal government. Let's finish today's lecture with a photo of a Cleveland strike during the 1930s at a GM plant. The company thugs are pictured, waiting for it, anticipating their chance to wreak havoc on the workers. Each man carries an iron tube to club them. The man in the middle, not content with just an iron tube, carries a brick as well. Now, after World War II, companies would try different tactics to maintain their leverage over workers. Tactics that were not necessarily violent, but were surely destructive. And that's the subject of our next lecture.